Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. And today, I'm going to respond to a friend of mine from the modern monetary theory community who was posting links to the work of Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford. Stanford News has a report where Pfeffer talked about the tech layoffs and blamed it on social contagion. Now, Pfeffer also talked about many things that I think are true, and that actually makes up the majority of his paper. Layoffs often do not restore profitability, thus they are seemingly irrational. They are costly. They have physiological effects, even in countries where there's a strong social safety net, like in Norway. An increase in suicide always accompanies mass layoffs. They have downstream effects on health, on through the increase of stress, in America, also strongly related to the instability around medical care and medical insurance. There are things that ripple throughout with layoffs that make them socially more costly than they seem, and do not, in the long term, restore profitability to a business. Deducing from that, Pfeffer says that social contagion is the cause. And I point out that that's just naming behavior. Saying companies are copycatting each other and that's because of social contagion is actually just saying they're copycatting each other because they're copycatting each other. I have some things to talk about around that. I'm going to talk about how businesses narrate layoffs to themselves, and then I'm going to tell you what the likely cause is actually, and there's a structural incentive for it. And Pfeffer's argument means we're not looking at the structure of our economy for why this seemingly perverse set of incentives that doesn't even necessarily help the company. In fact, in some companies, it induces death spirals where you lay more employees off, service declines, the service causes the product to be diminished, people use it less, they do more layoffs, etc., until the company is bought out and reestablished. Although usually with more layoffs, but subsumed into another country, so the losses are hidden, into another company, so the losses are hidden. But I need to talk about the history of social contagion as a concept, because if you understand this as a teaching moment, you'll see why I think applying social contagion to institutions is probably never wise, and why often social contagion is literally just avoiding the question. And the question is, why? Social contagion just names the thing describing in shorthand. Social contagion is generally defined as behaviors, emotions, and conditions that spread spontaneously through a group or network in a relatively short period of time. The phenomenon has been highly discussed and debated by social sciences since the 19th century. But most of the work on the subject is actually considered scholarly, but unclear, even contradictory on what social contagion is, so exact definitions vary. Often, social contagion is just a fancy way of saying copycat behavior without explaining why the copycat behavior is happening. Some scholars include unplanned spread of ideas to the population as social contagion, though others prefer to class that as mimesis or mimetics, all right, which is just mimicry. And humans do have a tendency to mimic even things that are irrational. I repeat a story that I heard about a study. I heard this on Decoding the Gurus, where they gave humans and chimpanzees a box that had a reward in it, And the chimpanzees would mimic what the humans did, but as they mimicked and discovered that parts of the human ritual was unnecessary, they would drop it, whereas humans would often repeat it regardless. Now, why is that? Well, the theory behind that is that humans have projective mechanisms to assume that even irrational things done by other humans serve a purpose, because we assume other people do things rationally, and thus we copy it because we assume there must be a reason, even if it's spiritual or superstitious. All right. That makes us an interesting lot on terms of of the development of ritual and technology, because the two are related. Chimpanzees and other great apes tend to actually streamline down by first copying, but then as they figure stuff out, they will reduce the things that are unnecessary if it looks obviously unnecessary. That's an interesting thing to think about when it comes to concepts like social contagion, but that's generally considered mimesis. The study of social contagion has really intensified in the last, say, 20 years. Um, Academics from social psychology, sociology, and network science are investigating online social networks as sources of social contagion. But the problem is that social contagion is a loose concept. And I will say, sometimes it's just naming things in a way that seems like it's giving a because, but it's just renaming. Well, these people are copycatting each other. Well, that's because social contagion. Well, what is social contagion? People having copycat behavior. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. While infection and mimesis has been kind of a pun going all the way back to Plato, at least that's the first recorded instance we have of it, the term behavioral contagion was first introduced to the political economic literature in Gustave Le Bon's book, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. Now, Gustave Le Bon is one of those polymaths in the 19th century who was influential in anthropology, psychology, sociology, medicine, physics, and even economics, in so much that economics in the 19th century was not yet fully separated from sociology, as we've talked about in many of my Nailing It Down videos. You find early sociologists, almost all of them are also either historians or economists or both, because the fields were not purely separated yet. I mean, they were both still dealing with the concepts of political economy, which didn't separate economics out as cleanly as neoclassical economics does. Herbert Blumer introduced the term social contagion in 1939 on a paper on collective behavior and began to trace the concept empirically. And he focused a lot on the dancing manias of the Middle Ages. There's no widely shared definition of social contagion, though, in any of these papers. In 1993, David A. Levy and Paul Neal published a review where they stated that social contagion captures the broadest sense of a phenomenon according to the subtypes of behavioral and emotional contagion. Paul Mars has suggested that social contagion is a similar phenomenon to mimetics or mimesis, again, a field of study inspired by Richard Dawkins' 1976 work, The Selfish Dream, but mimesis and mimetics have largely been discredited, so we don't talk about it much anymore. Mimetics was this idea that ideas and behaviors spread like viruses, and you could use viral patterns to trace them. The problem is that it's a metaphor. Ideas aren't viruses. And in about 2005, the Journal of Mimetics ceased publication. But if you were around the new atheist community in the aughts, memes and mimetic theory was all over the place. It is not generally a field that still exists, where social contagion does. So, what do we mean by emotional and behavioral contagion? So, what is being transmitted? The spread of ideas is sometimes considered a Karagati studied as part of memetics. Um, Dr. Paul Marsden said contagion can be split into 6 subcategories: hysterical contagions, deliberate self-harm contagions, contagions of aggressions, rule violation contagions, consumer behavior contagions, and financial behavior contagions. The issue is all these things have causes, right? There is a causal pathway, all right? In most cases now, people talk about disinhibitory contagion, echo contagion, and hysterical contagion. Disinhibitory contagion involves a type of behavior the person already has some desire to engage in, but they are normally afraid to do so because of social norms. However, when a crowd performs behavior, the social blockage is removed. There's no social stigma to things other people are doing, and so it spreads like wildfire, breaking any social inhibitory effect. That's the causal analysis. And that doesn't help us when we talk about tech companies, does it? Then echo contagion, which represents spontaneous behavior or transition or conformance to an emotional state shared by others, which means you see people experiencing something that looks emotionally pleasant and you do it. All right. Again, a very individual kind of contagion. Hard to explain the acts of institutions by echo contagion. Then there's, quote, hysterical contagion, which represents the spreading of unwanted transmission of behavior, emotion, or affect by a group by unknown means. So we don't know why it happens. All of which are involved by exposure. And not all of these are contagions. Now, these idea of social contagions are actually behind things like Cass Sunstein's nudge theory and positive climate change behavior. And it does suggest that rehabilitation with people who have positive reinforcement do help rehabilitate people who have fallen into antisocial behavior or addictions, etc., which is true. We know this because we know, for example, even people with really strong mental disorders tend to do better when they have social supports beyond just financial support. So being in a community really helps in these cases. So the whole thing with social contagion is, though, even though I've been able to tell you these things, is that it's not really explanatory. The entire concept is pretty widely criticized in social science. For one thing, it doesn't distinguish between types of social influence like command and compliance, form homophily, incentive structures, emotional and belonging structures, affective behavior, etc. 2, the contagion metaphor in both social contagion and in memetics is a metaphor. It can't be causal. All right? There is no virus. There is no pathology. In most cases, when we talked about the 3 kinds of social contagion, 2 of which are immediately explainable in individuals in mimicking behaviors which show positive results are in disinhibiting behaviors that people already want to do. And it seems like because people are all doing it, the social stigma is removed. Going back to Pfeffer's talk about tech layoffs, none of those apply to the tech layoffs. And beyond that, even in cases where we talk about social contagion is applied to things like transgender issues, or often right-wingers would call that a form of social contagion, they don't ask why it is being transmitted. They're not interested in that. Like, why is it a form of contagion? What do people get from it? So the comparison to a virus is just basically stigmatizing. You will rarely see me use the concept of social contagion, except in very specific instances where, like, for example, we're talking about disinhibitory contagion or an echo contagion, where people either see people in a state of bliss and mimic that in rapid succession in a crowd, or a crowd removes in its inhibitions. Otherwise, we're going to talk about like positive social reinforcement, or command and compliance, or social mimicry and sense of belonging, or affective behavior. And again, none of that explains what is going on in the tech sector. Now, to go back to Pfeffer's argument, he is right. All right, and we've known this for a while, that layoffs don't usually return long-term profitability. When a corporation starts to lose money, layoffs are an area of managerial control. You, if you're running out of funds, can lay people off to seemingly restore funds. Often it has massive knock-on effects, even in public sectors. So, for example, the mass layoff of teachers in the Great Recession led to an eventual 25% decline. We have maintained that percentage decline of teachers ever since. Now, there's other social reasons for that. I'm not saying the layoffs caused the fact that we haven't been able to retain teachers, but the breaking down of the workforce in education, which had been weakened priorly by things like Teach for America and the aughts and stuff like that, was cracked by those layoffs, but that actually had downstream effects that were in the aught teens positive for labor. So you started seeing red state radical militarism in teachers' unions because they could get away with it. They weren't as easily replaced. And the conditions were bad. Those two things together, in economic terms, what we call labor market inelasticity, meaning there's just not there's not a lot of supply for the demand for labor, and the demand is constant, leads to workers having a lot more power. Except that the state usually steps in because teachers are government employees and also don't even get the protections of normal labor law. That's a whole different video. I've talked about that before. But layoffs have negative downstream effects. Pfeffer's absolutely correct about that. They're costly. They don't tend to return long-term profits. So what do businesses say is the reasons why they lay off? Well, according to smallbusinesschiron.com, layoffs provide an opportunity for waste reduction. That's a way to increase your quote productivity per worker and get more for your money. It equals demand matching. That's when you're cutting costs because you have less income coming in. And it's a way to improve the margins. Business units or employees in a company may complete work that has little to no bearing on the profitability of a business. Thus, by removing non-profitable business costs, you can restore, according to this theory, profitability. And then it's a way to get rid of poor performers that you otherwise have to document and do legal actions to get rid of. That's why small businesses do it, according to smallbusiness.com. I'm not totally convinced by these arguments either. They don't apply to the tech sector entirely. The tech sector layoffs, as I've said before, and I'll even go further than Pfeffer, have been a fucking mess. They have been untargeted. Often, groups will lay off thousands of workers only to have to hire some of them back because they didn't know which functions were essential or not. Also, the quote bullshit jobs that everyone thinks were low performance, and we have seen a decline in profitability. And productivity, excuse me. Actually, we've seen a decline in profitability too. But in productivity, since the mid-aughts in labor, in fact, we were squeezing productivity really high until about 2008, 2009. And after the recession, productivity gains were never really regained. an interesting thing to think about is why that is. Because after the recession, also, while the entire 20th century and the 21st century has been the history of labor losing perpetually more shares of the little bit of wealth it had in the social compact, the acceleration of that in both the Great Recession and in COVID, and the concentration of wealth and asset prices, which is only beginning to fall apart recently, because these tech companies are losing tons of money right now. Not all of them, and some of the companies doing layoffs actually have government complex which ensure what they do. My MNT friends make more hay of this than I think they should, just like Keynesians make more hay of animal spirits, which is a way of saying we don't know how the stock market works, is that people tend to act with social contagion. Not an economic theory, my friends. Not even a viable theory of sociology. What are the incentives that cause it? Well, if you dig into the financial press, you'll actually find something very interesting. Both the News and Observer and Axios talked about the tech layoffs are a stock price problem. While it is true that these companies are losing tons of money right now, we've seen a 5% increase in tech stocks during this time period, seemingly returning profitability. You see, what Pfeffer's answer of social contagion doesn't deal with is this is a structural problem. The legal incentive to always increase stock prices for stockholders, even when modified by like stakeholder ethics, which doesn't seem to change these patterns significantly, so stakeholder capitalism doesn't really help that much, means that an increase of the short-term stock price is incentivized over the long-term profitability and viability of a company, because the stockholders don't care. If the stock is bought and the company is absorbed into another company, they tend not to lose. As Axios says, the tech layoffs are a stock price problem, not an economic problem. Why is it not an economic problem? Because the profitability of these companies, which they are really losing, most of these are rentier companies, by the way, although not all of them, the ability to command money from ads and people to use their resources has dropped since the cost of debt has gone up. But the cost of the layoffs probably aren't going to really offset that. But immediate return to stockholders will. So what we're calling social contagion is really stock manipulation for the stakeholders. And maybe calling it manipulation isn't even right, because this is legally mandated. So to sum up, no, Virginia, tech layoffs are not just social contagion. There is an incentive. The incentive is in the structure of corporate capitalism, and it's specific to corporate capitalism. This is not even just in the structure of capitalism. This is not about competing and staying alive in long-term profitability like an early entrepreneurial or sole proprietor capitalism. This is about stock prices. Yes, the tech companies are losing tons of money, and we saw a lot of the tech CEOs who are, the top of the Forbes 500 list. Now, remember, I told you that's also deceptive, because wealth in families is diffused and often doesn't show up there, shows up in other lists. But beside that, if you look at these patterns and really look at them, you will see that this is structural. Social contagion is not super explanatory all the time. There are times where I think it is. We talk about disinhibitory social contagion, where you want to do something like, I don't know, hurt people, or, make out in the street or break a window. And you see large groups of people doing it, so you do it because the social prohibition is removed. That is perfectly understandable. That part of this theory holds up. Echo contagion, where people do things because it seems to be bringing about some positive trait immediately, so people copy the behavior. Also explanatory in individuals. Hysterical contagion is not understood. It's like, we don't understand why this is spreading. It's just spreading. And I suspect there's a myriad of reasons that actually go into that. But even with all that aside, those apply to individuals. They don't apply to institutions. And while if this was just individual CEOs doing this, we could say this was a kind of copycat behavior to try to get ahead of profitability loss in case government contracts become less less likely, etc. By the way, that's not irrational when we have the debt ceiling hanging over everything. So don't forget that. I hope this helps you not buy into simple narratives, because I've seen a lot of leftists talk about, oh, these tech layoffs are just social contagion because even the general economy is still good right now. That's not the case. One, these tech companies that aren't on government contracts have been losing money, particularly the social media ones and the ones that were highly based on leveraging the cost of debt versus capital inflows from advertising and venture capital. Thirdly, there's been a ton of scams in the general tech market lately because people can't really evaluate what can be disrupted or not. Think about Theranos. Think about crypto, NFTs, etc. Take all these things in consideration when someone tells you it's social contagion, because usually you need to ask, what's the vector of contamination and what would incentivize that? Because thoughts are not a virus, my friend. That's a silly metaphor. Like and subscribe. You can subscribe to the Patreon and get the audio version of this and everything, and additional shows, including my co-shows with Sean KB of Antifada fame, etc. I hope you have a great day and read the articles. The links that I refer to will be in the show notes. Think for yourself. Don't accept simple answers, and don't accept renamings as an answer. So many people get away with circular logic. You need to be, and even academics do, you need to be smarter than that. Don't fall for the prestidigitation of mere words.